I have taught many poker students to crush live cash games, but I know from reading many of your comments here on YouTube that you all struggle with live cash games. So today I'm going to be giving you my best live cash game tips so that you can crush the games too. If you want to beat the small stakes games for a small amount, it's actually not that hard at all. All you have to do is follow the old school poker strategy where you play tight and patient and you rarely bluff and you play small pots with good hands. And if you do this, you will win a small amount of money. But that is not my goal for my poker students. I want them to win a ton of money from poker. I want them to win life-changing amounts of money from poker. And you do that by not playing the weak, tight, straightforward strategy. If you play that strategy, you will never become an excellent world-class poker player. If you want to crush live cash games for a ton of money, you have come to the right place. The way you crush the games is by having solid fundamentals, can't say the word fundamentals, solid fundamentals, and you need to make sure you adjust to exploit the mistakes in your opponent's strategies. Unfortunately, in the small stakes games, most of your opponents will make very, very big errors because if they were world-class players themselves, they would have moved up to bigger games where they can make a lot of money. So if you have solid fundamentals and you exploit your opponents, you will be a big winner in live cash games. So let's start with the fundamentals. It is vital that you have a strong pre-flop strategy. So what does that mean? Well, first things first, enter the pot with a raise when it folds around to you. Do not open limp. That is a big blunder. And when you do raise to 2.5 to 3.5 times the size of the big blind. I realize that in some live cash games, people raise to 10 times the blind or 20 times the blind. Turns out that's a bad strategy. And you should not model your poker strategy off of players in the small stakes games who are not moving up to the bigger games. Turns out if you copy losing strategies, well, you'll probably will lose yourself. So enter the pot with a raise to 2.5 or 3.5 big blinds and do not open limp. Next, when someone raises in front of you, you are going to want to re-raise or 3-bet a ton unless you are specifically on the button or the big blind. And the nice thing about this is that it will usually result in you winning the pot before the flop or making the pot heads up. And it turns out in most cash games, there is a pretty big rake. And you really want to avoid paying the rake. And in most places, you only pay the big rake if you see the flop. And re-raising will result in you not seeing the flop some portion of the time, which is quite beneficial. So re-raise a lot. And also, you're going to want to play generally tight, aggressive strategies. I realize that in most live cash games, they are very loose and very splashy. But again, most people model their play after their opponents. They think, oh, everybody else is limping in with the 9-6 offsuit. I should do that as well. But it turns out it's not a good play. Again, whenever the casino is taking a big rake out of the pot, you just cannot justify seeing the flop with hands that do very poorly. You're going to want to play tightly and aggressively. And I realize that may not be the most exciting most exciting style of poker, where you get to see lots of flops and play lots of hands. But I'm trying to teach my students how to win money. I'm approaching this subject from that point of view. I'm not approaching this subject from the point of view of how do you get your gamble on, right? So if you want to win money, you must play tight, aggressive strategies. So what do we mean by this? Well, let's take a look at a few game theory optimal charts and talk about a few adjustments you can make in your games. So let's take a look at this chart here. This is the low jack raise first in strategy. That's what RFI means. You're going to want to raise the hands in red, fold the hands in blue. Notice no limping in. And you're going to see this is actually pretty tight. So where is the low jack? The low jack is first to act if you were six-handed. Okay? So you have the big blind, then the small blind, then the button, then the cutoff, then the hijack, then the low jack. All right? You'll see that really you're only raising the best hands. You may be slightly surprised to see these King X suited is raising, but it turns out King X suited is actually a pretty good hand. You'll also notice hands like Queen 10 offsuit and Jack 10 offsuit are not played. All Broadway hands are not premium. Now I will say that you can actually widen these ranges a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. And the reason for that is because these charts presume your opponents are going to play well. And it turns out most people in most live cash games do not re-raise nearly often enough. They do a lot of calling. And if they do a lot of calling, it means you're not going to have to fold out the weaker hands in your range to a re-raise. So if I was to adjust this range a bit, I would raise ace-2 suited, king-5, king-6, and king-7 suited, all the king-jack offsuits, all the ace-10 offsuits. I probably wouldn't play the king-10 offsuit, but you could play the king-10 offsuit, maybe even the queen-jack offsuit. And then I would play all the pocket 6s, 5s, and 4s, and probably a few more suited connectors, like 9, 8, 8, 7, 7, 6, 6, 5, 5, 4. I would just raise all of those. It's a little bit looser, but notice it's not insanely loose where you're raising the 10-6 suited or the 10-8 offsuit. If you do that, you're going to have a very, very difficult time winning. Now, from the button, you see you get to raise substantially wider when everyone folds to you. Now, this implies there's not a bunch of limpers, right? If there's a bunch of limpers, your strategy will change. But whenever it folds to you on the button, you get to raise a decent amount of hands. And again, you can probably raise a little bit wider than this because most people do not re-raise often enough. Again, a little bit wider, but not a lot wider. Also, when you're facing a raise, you're going to want to 3-bet a lot. 100 big blinds deep, a cutoff versus a low jack, raise first in strategy. We are re-raising the hands in red, calling the hands in green, folding the hands in blue. You may be shocked to see that like ace-jack offsuit just folds. Pocket 7s folds a lot of the time. Pocket 5s folds a lot of the time. What else folds? A lot of these ace-x suiteds fold a lot of the time. And that is good, strong GTO poker. Now, I do know that if your opponent's raised too wide, you in turn get to play slightly wider yourself. But you still want to be 3-betting a lot. And it turns out the only hands that really want to call from a GTO point of view are the good, strong hands that flop well. Those are going to be good, strong, high-suited cards and pairs and suited connectors. It turns out most of these offsuit hands really like to 3-bet the majority of the time. All right? What about whenever you're in the small blind in particular? This is a position where you want to be 3-betting every hand you're going to play whenever there is a rake in a live cash game. If you're playing a game with no rake, for whatever reason, maybe the house takes a little bit of money whenever you come into the casino, or they take rake each hour or every 30 minutes, then you do get to play a little bit looser because there's not money taken out of every pot. But if the casino's taking money out of every pot, you really do not want to call anyone's raise from the small blind because then the big blind gets to call and you're going to be in really bad position after the flop and the casino's going to take a rake. So from the small blind facing a raise, you're going to want to 3-bet every hand you're going to play. And that's the GTO strategy. That is what you should do against pretty much everyone besides the weakest, well, besides the tightest opponents who are going to be playing very, very strong hands only. As you see, though, still a pretty tight strategy. And from out of position in the small blind, I really would not widen this strategy all that much. Okay? Let's go through 2 post-flop tips to help you crush the live cash games now. Tip number 1, stop paying people off when you know you are beat. And tip number 2, do not be afraid to go for value. So many people make the blunder of just paying off because they think their hand is good. But it turns out that's a pretty big mistake. You are allowed to fold whenever your generally tight, cautious opponent wants to put in a lot of money. Here we have a $10 raise, folds around us. We call with the king 5 suited, which, to be fair, is already a little bit loose, facing a 5 big blind raise. We get the top pair. We check call the flop. You may say, why not raise? Because if we raise, we're going to get called by mostly better hands or hands with pretty good equity. Turns a 10, which is not a great card at all. Now queen 10 gets there, ace jack gets there, jack 9 gets there. We check, opponent bets 25. Folding would be a little bit tight now, but whatever, we call, that's fine. River's a 7, we check, opponent goes $75, and this is where you simply must fold. If you find that you call in this spot because you have top pair and top pair is pretty good, you're probably not going to beat the small stakes games because most people do not bluff nearly often enough, especially when a lot of money goes into the pot. So this is a spot where you must be disciplined and find a fold. If we had a hand like King Jack here, it's close. King Jack is close. If we had 2 pair, I don't think you can go around folding 2 pair. But this is a scenario where I think you're going to find that the hijack has way too few bluffs, and they're also not going to be value betting thinly with a hand like Queen Jack. So if they're not value betting a queen, it means they have a king or better. And they're raising from the hijack, so they probably don't have too many weaker kings in their range. So you're probably just you're against a good hand. So if you're against a good hand, fold. Stop paying people off when it is clear they have a good hand. Next, don't be afraid to go for value. Let's take a look at another hand here. We have the pocket aces. Hijack raises. We're going to re-raise our pocket aces to about 3.5 times their raise. By the way, when someone raises and you decide to 3-bet them, you want to go to about 3.5 times their raise in position and about 4 or 4.5 times when you are in the small blind or big blind. We get called. King, Jack, 7, hijack checks. We will definitely continuation bet small and frequently in this scenario. We do get called. Turns to 9 of clubs, hijack checks. Ugh. What do you want to do in this spot? Take a second, think about it, and pause the video and write what you would do in the comments section below, right down there. If you would check, bet $40, bet $80, or bet $160. I'll wait for you to do it. Go ahead. This 9 of clubs is especially bad for us because it's really easy for the hijack to have a newly found 2-pair or a straight or a flush. So this is a spot where even though we do want to be value betting somewhat thinly for value, this is a really bad card. So whenever you get a really bad card, you need to check it back. We do check it back. River's a 7 of spades, opponent checks again. Now we have to go for value. We have the best hand almost always when the opponent checks the turn and the river, because almost all players in small stakes cash games will value bet the river with a flush or a straight or a full house. So if they don't have a flush or a straight or a full house, we have the best hand. Nice and easy. So now we need to make a bet that will get called by our opponent's most likely made hands that can call a bet, which will be a king, maybe a jack. How much will a king call? Probably something like $100. How much will a jack call? I don't know. A jack may not even call, but if it does call, it'll probably only be for a small bet, like $60. So should we bet 100 or should we bet 60? I think it's kind of close, but in general, I would just go for the bigger size. I think you're going to find that some players just find calls in cash games whenever you don't go egregiously big. So I would go for 100 in this spot. We do go 100. We collect a call. We win a nice pot. Do not be afraid to go for value. This is a spot, I'm telling you, where a lot of your opponents will just check it back and be happy to win the pot. A lot of people get happy when they win the pot. But in reality, they could have won an extra $100, which is a ton of money. Let's go now through 2 big exploits for live cash games. The first is to use overbets to your advantage, both for value and as a bluff. And also the exploit where you just do not slow play your big hands. From a GTO point of view, you actually should slow play some portion of the time, but in a lot of live cash games, people will just call bets and they'll get their money in a little bit too thin with hands that perhaps should not be getting it in. So let's talk about using overbets to your advantage. Here we have the king, queen. We raise it up. Big blind calls. Flop comes king, 10, 6. Big blind checks. We continuation bet. They call. Turns to 7 of diamonds. They check. Take a second and think about this spot. I want you to pause the video again. 2 quizzes in 1 video. Aren't you lucky? Pause the video and write again in the comments section below. Would you check? Would you bet $30? Would you bet $60? Or would you overbet? Would you go $120? Go ahead, pause the video, and write what you would do in the comments section below. This is a spot where you want to go for the overbet. A very common scenario where the GTO strategy is to overbet is when there are 2 flush draws on the board and the board is very coordinated and you have either a junky draw, a premium draw, or a made hand that is almost certainly good but very vulnerable. And that's exactly what we have right here. So we're going to go for the overbet. Actually, don't even mind going a little bit bigger. We go 100 here. That's fine. Maybe 120 is even better, depending on your opponent's tendencies. Opponent calls. River is a 4 of spades. Opponent checks. And now, I think this is another really good spot for an overbet. You may say, what will my opponent call with? Well, it turns out when a lot of draws miss, your opponents are going to find hero calls. And notice in this scenario, basically all the draws missed. So, go for the jam. We go for the jam, and we collect a call. And notice what a lot of people do wrong in this spot is they raise and they continuation bet, just like we did. But on the turn, they bet $40 or $50. And then they get called. But notice at this point, the pot would be $100 less. It'd be $170 instead of $270, right? And we would have $50 more in our stack. And then on the river, we would not be able to go for the all-in because the pot would be 2.5 or 3 times the size of our stack. By overbetting the turn, we get to put in the big river bet and get a double up instead of winning only a little bit. Of course, you can also use overbets as bluffs, especially when your opponent is very capped. Whenever your opponent very likely has a marginal made hand and you could have a lot of nuts, that becomes a really good bluffing spot. Let's discuss slow playing. Don't do it. Here we have a set. Somebody raises, we call. With 5s in the big blind, we flop a set. We check, they continuation bet. Definitely put in the raise, especially when the board is very coordinated, as it is here, and your opponent's very likely to have something, as they are here, because they raised from the low jack seat. They're going to have a lot of big cards. This is a spot where you just want to check raise immediately. And notice if they don't have anything, like 8-7 offsuit, 8-7 of spades, let's say, they're probably not going to put much more money in the pot anyway. And if they do have a hand like pocket 8s, you don't really care if they fold because they're not going to put much more in. They're not going to put in much more money anyway, unless they turn a set, which you lose to. So this is a great spot to put in the check raise with your sets, with your 2 pairs, and just load the money in. We get jammed on, obviously call. We could be beat. Sometimes they're going to get stacked. Sometimes they're going to show up with the king 10 of hearts. This time they have the aces. We win a sizable pot. Notice if we did check call the flop in slow play, sometimes it turns a heart, or maybe a king or a 10, and the opponent checks it back. And again, we would not stack them. When you have a good hand, just get your money in a manner that lets your opponent put their money in. Before we wrap it up today, I have 3 off-the-felt tips for live cash games. Tip number 1, study constantly and improve daily. You want to make sure you're taking notes on your hands and sharing them with people who are working hard at their poker game and who are ideally a little bit better than you. Tip number 2 is to exploit. If you play live cash games at a popular casino, a lot of those places have live streams where you can watch your opponents play before you actually go and play with them. So take notes and figure out what they do incorrectly. And when you are actually playing at the casino, pay attention and exploit your opponents. Tip number 3 is to have good bankroll management. So many poker players think that they're going to take whatever money they have, they're going to go to the casino, and they're going to try to get rich quick. And every once in a while, someone does. But I hate to break it to you. Poker is a really, really, really bad way to get rich quick. But it's a really great way to get rich slowly. You have to make sure you're playing well within your bankroll, and you play in games that you can beat. All you have to do to win at poker is find a game you can beat, which implies either you're playing against really bad players or you've studied a little bit. You have to play that game a lot. You have to actually put in volume, and you must keep a proper bankroll because even if you're good, you're inevitably going to go on downswings. And for live cash games, I recommend you have at least 20 buy-ins in your bankroll, assuming a buy-in is something like 100 big blinds. That's about the minimum I would recommend. I have an article on bankroll management at pokercoaching.com/bankroll. Check that out if you want to study more about bankroll management. So that's it. Those are all of my best tips for live cash games. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, do me a favor. Click the like and subscribe buttons below. There's also a notification bell down there somewhere. Click that. I try to put out lots of good, high-quality content for you on YouTube. So make sure you click that notification bell. I appreciate all of you being here. Good luck in your games. If you use these tips to crush live cash games, come back and let me know in the comment section. And I'll talk to you next time.